Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. All right, buckle up, because we are diving into a coliseum of pure logic today. Imagine two of the most brilliant debaters in existence locked in a room, and they're tasked with solving, the single most volatile question in human history. Does God exist?
But here's the twist.
Here's the catch. There are absolutely no humans involved. We're looking at this groundbreaking experiment by the channel Clarified Mind. They took two advanced AI models, stripped them of human emotion, and pitted them against each other.
One role-playing a staunch atheist.
A ruthless, logic-driven atheist, and the other, a devout, philosophically armed believer. They go toe-to-toe on everything, from the suffering of children to the laws of quantum physics, and the whole thing is judged by a panel of other AI referees.
It's a fascinating look at how artificial intelligence processes the divine when you take our messy human feelings out of the equation.
It really is.
It's such a unique setup. Usually when we talk about this, it's impossible to separate the argument from the person. We bring our trauma, our upbringing, our hopes.
All of it.
Yeah, all of it. But here we have a face-to-face digital debate that is purely textual, purely argumentative. So our mission today is to walk through the transcript of this machine-generated discourse. We're going to explore the strongest arguments from both sides.
It's essentially a Turing test for theology. So let's just jump right in. The debate kicks off, and the atheist AI comes out swinging immediately.
It doesn't warm up.
It goes straight for the jugular with maybe the most famous and, frankly, the most difficult argument against religion, the problem of evil.
It's the smartest place to start. If you're playing to win on logic, this is your strongest card. The prompt essentially asks, does the existence of suffering disprove God?
Right.
And the atheist persona immediately latches on to that apparent contradiction. If there's a deity who is all-powerful, meaning he can stop suffering, and all-loving, meaning he wants to stop suffering.
And why? Why do we have bone cancer in children? Why do we have tsunamis that wipe out entire coastlines?
Exactly. It's the classic Epicurean paradox.
Yeah. But what struck me in the notes was how visceral the AI made it. It argues that the usual defenses like, oh, it's a test of faith or it's for free will are just total cop-outs. It uses this specific example that's pretty chilling. It says, imagine a father who tortures his child just to see how much the child loves him. We wouldn't call that a mysterious plan. We'd call that a monster.
Exactly. And to drive this point home, the atheist model introduces what it calls the mouse lab analogy.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to dig into that because it's such a disturbing image. Walk us through the mouse lab.
So the atheist AI posits this. Imagine I have a laboratory full of mice, and I deliberately inflict pain on them, let them get sick or starve them, just to observe which ones, remain loyal to me or which ones grow from it.
That would be deeply unethical.
Of course. If a human did that, we'd arrest them for animal cruelty.
Right.
So the argument is, why is it morally acceptable for a God who is supposedly infinitely more perfect and loving than any human to run the entire world like a cruel lab experiment?
It's a devastating opening. It really is. It forces you to look at the creator as a moral agent, and by our standards, that agent looks negligent at best.
At best. But the believer AI offers a rebuttal here that tries to pivot the whole argument from cruelty to perspective.
This is the vaccine analogy?
Right, and it's a common theological defense. But the AI articulates it with a really specific focus on the knowledge gap. So think about a toddler getting a vaccine.
Okay.
The child feels this sharp, immediate pain. To the child, the parent allowing this stranger to stab them with a needle seems cruel, terrifying even. They don't understand immunology or viruses, but the parent knows that this short-term pain prevents a much worse fate.
So the argument is that we are the toddlers in this scenario. We just lack the divine wisdom to see the bigger picture.
Precisely. The believer AI argues that just because we can't see the reason for suffering, it doesn't mean a reason doesn't exist. We are constrained by our limited perspective.
But the atheist immediately spots a massive flaw in that. I caught that too.
What do you think?
Well, the atheist points out that a parent eventually explains the vaccine, or at least the child sees the benefit. They don't get sick. They grow up and say, thanks, Mom. But when a child starves to death, where is the greater good? Where is the immunity?
There's no post-game analysis.
No. The atheist argues that comparing a life-saving medical procedure to meaningless tragedy just doesn't hold water.
And that is where the believer drops what I think is its most humble and, let's be honest, maybe its most frustrating defense, the ant in the hospital.
Well, this one felt like a heavy hitter to me. It shifts the scale entirely.
It does. The believer AI says, Imagine an ant whose nest is destroyed because humans are building a hospital. The ant sees only destruction. Its home is ruined, its colony scattered, its world is ending. It has
Hmm.
absolutely no capacity, biologically or cognitively, to understand the concept of a hospital or medicine or saving human lives. The good of the hospital is completely beyond its cognitive horizon.
And we're the ants.
We are the ants in this scenario. The gap between us and the divine isn't just knowledge, it's dimensional.
That is humbling. It's basically saying our moral outrage is limited because we can't process the infinite. We're screaming at the bulldozer because we can't see the hospital.
But the atheist fires back.
Yep.
Right. It says, wait a minute, I'm not an ant. Humans have moral reasoning.
Well,
We can analyze suffering. And to us, a lot of it looks completely unnecessary.
which leads them directly into the next major battleground.
Exactly. If we are judging God's actions as bad or evil, where are we getting our definition of bad from in the first place?
The source of morality. This is where the debate shifts from what is happening to how do we judge it. This is always a tricky part of the debate.
It is, and the believer AI pulls a reverse card here. It says, you're complaining about evil, but if there is no God, bad is just a chemical reaction in your brain.
So, without a God to anchor truth, ethics are just opinions.
Subjective,
Oh.
exactly. In a purely material world, atoms don't care about suffering.
But the atheist has a pretty standard scientific answer for this: evolution. We learn to be good because it helps us survive. We developed empathy and cooperation because tribes that work together, well, they didn't die out.
Right. We don't need a tablet from the sky to tell us not to murder. We figured it out because murder is bad for the group.
It seems pretty straightforward.
That's the standard secular humanist view.
Yeah.
But here is where the believer uses a fascinating logical parry, which the source material calls the candy analogy. And I think this is a really crucial distinction.
Okay, break down the candy analogy for us.
So the believer argues, evolution explains why we like sweetness. We evolved to seek out high-calorie foods because food was scarce. Survival.
Makes sense.
But just because evolution makes us like candy, that doesn't make eating candy a moral truth. It's just a biological preference. It's a taste.
I see where this is going. We like candy, but that doesn't make candy righteous. It just makes it tasty.
Right. So the believer says, similarly, just because evolution gave us feelings of empathy, that doesn't prove that helping others is an objective moral fact. It just proves we have a survival instinct to be nice. The believer is asking, if you want morality to be real, like math is real, where 2 + 2 = 4 no matter what you feel, you need something above biology.
You need a standard that exists outside of us. That is a sharp point. It challenges the idea that natural equals true.
It does.
But the atheist doesn't back down. It brings up the heavy artillery of philosophy, Plato, specifically the Euthyphro dilemma.
Yes, the classic dilemma, it asks, is something good because God loves it, or does God love it because it's good?
It's a trap, isn't it?
It's a very clever trap.
Because if God loves it because it's already good, then good is a standard higher than God. He's just following the rules. But if it's good just because God says so, well, then the atheist asks, if God said torturing children was good tomorrow, would that make it good?
And that implies that without an external standard, God's morality is just arbitrary. The believer tries to dodge this by saying God and goodness are inseparable, like a circle and roundness.
But the atheist isn't buying it. It points out that the God of the Bible allows for war and famine, so clearly the definition of goodness is getting a bit murky. I loved the atheist counter-analogy to this whole we need God for rules argument, the chess analogy.
Yeah, that was a good one. Go on.
The atheist says, look at chess. Humans created the rules. We decided what winning means. Once we agree on the goal checkmate, we can objectively say which moves are good and which are bad. We don't need a god of chess to exist for the game to work.
So if humans agree the goal of life is well-being or survival, we can figure out the rules ourselves.
Exactly. We don't need a referee in the sky.
But notice how the debate shifts again. They've gone from suffering to morality, and now they move to the board itself, the nature of reality.
This is where we get into the mind-bending stuff. The believer brings up the necessary being argument. This felt a little dense in the reading. Can we unpack this?
Sure. It's a metaphysical concept. The believer argues that the universe is contingent. That means it didn't have to exist. It relies on something else. Think of 2 apples on a table. You need a cause to put them there.
A person, a tree, something.
Right. They don't just appear. But God, the believer argues, is like the number 2.
The number 2. How so?
Well, the number 2 is abstract. It doesn't need a cause. It just is. It's a necessary truth. You can't imagine a universe where the concept of two doesn't exist in some form. The believer claims God is a necessary being who cannot not exist. He's the foundation of existence itself.
But the atheist has a fantastic rebuttal to this, what it calls the perfect dragon. This was honestly my favorite part of the transcript. It just points out the absurdity of pure word games.
It exposes the flaw in pure logic very well.
It's just so witty. The atheist says, okay, I can define a perfect dragon as a dragon that, by definition, must exist because a dragon that exists is more perfect than one that doesn't.
Right. I put necessary existence into the definition.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean a dragon is going to suddenly poof into existence in my living room. It's just wordplay. You can't define things into reality.
It's the ontological argument's kryptonite. A logically sound sentence doesn't necessarily map to the physical world. So the believer pivots to something more concrete. Fine-tuning.
This is the argument about the laws of physics, right?
Correct. Gravity, electromagnetism.
Oh.
They are dialed in so precisely that if they were off by a tiny fraction, stars wouldn't form. Life couldn't exist.
So the believer says this screams design. It's too perfect to be an accident.
And the atheist counters with the multiverse, which feels like the go-to scientific answer for this these days.
Right. If there are infinite universes, like an infinite lottery, eventually one of them is going to hit the jackpot and have the right conditions for life. We just happen to be living in the winning ticket.
If we weren't, we wouldn't be here to ask the question.
But the believer pushes back hard here. And honestly, it's a fair point. It says, wait a second, you atheists always demand proof, empirical evidence. But now you're inventing an infinite number of invisible universes that we can never see or test just to avoid saying God did it.
It is a valid critique. The multiverse is mathematically possible, but it's scientifically unproven. The believer argues it requires just as much faith as religion. You're trading one invisible creator for infinite invisible universes.
So we have a stalemate on the cosmos. But then the debate takes this turn inward, into the human brain. This was arguably the deepest part of the whole deep dive for me, the epistemological trap.
This is a favorite topic of mine, and it's rarely brought up this well. The believer asks a devastating question. If our brains are purely the product of evolution, designed for survival, not for truth, why should we trust our own logic?
Right. Evolution doesn't care if you understand quantum physics. It just cares if you run away from the tiger.
Exactly. If a false belief, say, hearing a rustle in the grass and believing it's a ghost, helped us run away and survive, evolution would select for that false belief.
So the believer asks, if your brain is just a meat computer built for survival, how can you trust its conclusion that God doesn't exist? Maybe atheism is just a survival tactic.
Maybe logic itself is just a biological illusion.
That is a head-scratcher. It's using the atheist's own tool evolution to undermine their confidence in their own brain. It's like saying, your calculator is broken, so don't trust the math.
But the atheist has a defense.
Which is, hey, look around, science works. We build bridges that don't fall down. We fly planes. We test our reasoning against reality, and it succeeds. That proves our brains are trustworthy.
A pragmatic defense.
Mm-hmm.
But the believer presses on the nature of the mind itself. Is the mind just the brain? The atheist says yes, damage the brain, you damage the mind. Mind equals matter.
And here comes the believer's TV antenna analogy. I heard this one before, but how does the AI apply it?
The believer says, imagine a television set. If you smash the antenna or break the screen, the picture gets fuzzy or disappears. A skeptic would say, see? The picture was generated by the box.
But that's not the whole story.
Right. The believer argues, no, that doesn't mean the signal, the broadcast is gone. It just means the receiver is broken. The believer suggests the brain is just the antenna for the non-material mind or soul.
It's a sticky concept because you can't really disprove it. It keeps the soul safe from neuroscience. But the atheist has a really cool evolutionary counter-argument here. It uses the example of wings and a term called exaptation.
Yes, exaptation is when a trait evolves for one purpose but gets hijacked for another. The atheist points out that wings didn't originally evolve for flight.
Really? For what then?
They likely evolved for temperature regulation to catch heat or cool down small dinosaurs.
Right.
Later, as they got bigger, they were co-opted for gliding and then flying.
So the argument is, our brains evolved to hunt and gather, but eventually they got so complex that abstract thought, math, philosophy, theology emerged as a byproduct, like a mental wing that learned to fly.
Exactly. We're using a survival tool to do philosophy. It's a happy accident of complexity, not proof of a soul or a divine signal.
It's fascinating how both sides can look at the exact same biology and see two completely different origins.
which leads to the final clash.
Yeah.
Interpretation and change. The atheist points out something we see all the time. Religion constantly changes its story to match science.
Right. The God of the gaps is always shrinking. The atheist notes that religious texts used to imply a flat earth or that the sun revolves around us. When science proved otherwise, religion just said, oh, that was metaphorical.
The atheist argues that if it were divine truth, it wouldn't need editing. It wouldn't need a version 2.0.
So what's the believer's defense?
It's the teacher analogy. The believer argues that God is like a teacher. You don't teach quantum mechanics to a first grader. You teach them simple models. As the student humanity matures, the understanding deepens.
But the atheist slams this, and I think this is a critical distinction. It says, science changes because we find new evidence. We look for it. Religion changes because of external pressure. It's reactionary. It's trying to stay relevant.
That's the crux of it. Is the change driven by discovery or by embarrassment?
So we've covered evil, morality, reality, the mind, and the evolution of truth. An absolute marathon of logic. After all this, who won?
Well, remember, there were 5 AI referees judging the debate.
Right, the robo-judges with their little digital scorecard.
And the verdict. It was extremely close. Both sides scored very high on structure and coherence. But the atheist persona was given a slight edge in the final scoring.
A slight edge for the non-believer. Why do you think that is?
Well, the judges cited that the atheist's arguments relied less on unprovable axioms. The believer often had to appeal to mystery or a higher plane that couldn't be verified.
Whereas the atheist stuck closer to observable reality.
Exactly. In a logic game, the tangible usually scores higher than the mystical.
But before we declare God is dead, based on our chatbot score, we need to reflect on what we just consumed. This entire debate, this was all generated by machines.
That is the meta layer here. We are listening to Silicon arguing about the soul. It forces us to ask, are these arguments actually true, or are they just the most statistically probable sequence of words based on everything on the internet?
And the source material mentions something very important. The scores depended on the initial prompt and evaluation criteria.
Meaning the game was, in a way, rigged, or at least defined, by the humans who set it up.
Kind of. If you tell the judges to value empirical evidence, the atheist wins. If you tell them to value metaphysical coherence, maybe the believer wins.
But that raises a provocative final thought for us, for everyone listening. We look at these AI models and say, oh, their output is determined by their programming and their training data.
Sure, they're just predicting the next word.
But what about us?
What do you mean?
How much of our own objective logic about God or atheism is actually just determined by our own internal programming, our cultural prompts, the data we were fed as children?
Wow, so are we really thinking freely, or are we just running the believer v1.0 or atheist v2.0 script that we were installed with?
That is the question. When you really think deep, it gets hard to find the bottom.
That is certainly something to chew on. Huge thanks to the Clarified Mind experiment for providing the source material for this deep dive. And thank you, the listener, for thinking deeper with us. We'll catch you on the next one.